Her face was no longer hers, her voice barely a whisper. And yet, she looked straight into the camera and said, "I want the right to choose when my suffering ends." This isn't just a story about illness, it's a story about dignity, defiance, and a letter that shook an entire country. If you've ever watched someone you love suffer in silence, this story will stay with you. Subscribe to hear real stories that challenge what we think we know about life, death, and everything in between. Have you or someone you love ever faced a moment where you felt powerless in the face of illness? Tell us in the comments, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is share. It was the kind of morning that held its breath. No birdsong, no rustling wind, just the faint hum of silence that seemed to seep into the walls. Camille turned the key in the lock of her mother's apartment. It gave way easily, too easily. "Maman?" Her voice was soft, tentative, the kind of voice that didn't want to break something already fragile. The living room was neat, too neat. A teacup rested on the table, half full, still warm. A paperback book lay open on the armrest of the chair, Marguerite Duras, yellowed pages folded from use. And there, in the center of it all, was her. Chantal Sabir lay on the couch, wrapped in her favorite wool blanket, her hands folded over her chest. Her face, once so marked by illness, now looked strangely peaceful. At rest, finally. On her chest, a single dried lavender flower. Camille did not scream. She did not rush to touch the body. She only stood there, one hand still clutching her purse, the other covering her mouth. The scent of lavender filled her nose, sharp and soft all at once. It was the same scent that used to linger on her mother's scarves, in the books she carried, in the drawers of their old house. There was no note, no final words written on crumpled paper, just that flower left as a signature. Some might say her mother died in silence. But Camille knew better. This death had been echoing for months, no, years. It had started the day her mother first lost her voice, not literally, but in the way pain begins to muffle everything else. This was not the beginning of a tragedy, nor was it the end. It was the final period on a sentence Chantal had been trying to finish for too long. Camille stepped forward and knelt beside her mother. Her fingers brushed the lavender, then the blanket, then stopped over Chantal's hand, still and cool. Not cold, not yet. She let her hand rest there quietly, like punctuation. She would call the doctor soon, then the authorities. There would be procedures, paperwork, statements, but not now. Now, she would sit. And maybe, just maybe, listen to the story her mother had been trying to tell all along, one that didn't start with this death, but with a woman who had once lived and taught and laughed and hurt. A woman who had begged, not for life and not for death, but for the right to choose between them. Camille closed her eyes. Yes, she thought. It's time someone told her story. Camille remembered the way her mother's hands moved when she spoke, precise, deliberate, like she was still holding chalk and standing in front of a classroom. Even in casual conversation, Chantal had that presence. Not forceful, but steady. She wasn't someone you ignored. She was someone you listened to. Plombières-les-Dijon was a small town, the kind of place where people knew each other's schedules better than their own. Chantal had been a fixture there, Madame Sabir, the literature teacher with the soft voice and sharp wit. She had taught at the local college for over 20 years. Generations of students remembered her lessons on Camus and Sartre, her refusal to spoon-feed opinions, her insistence that questions mattered more than answers. She had always dressed simply, neat trousers, linen blouses, and cardigans in faded shades of gray and blue. She carried her books in a worn leather satchel, annotated in red ink, her handwriting slanted and fierce. She didn't wear perfume, but her hair always smelled faintly of lavender and soap. After her husband died in a traffic accident when Camille was just 7, Chantal raised her daughter alone. She didn't complain. She didn't talk about grief. She simply got up, made breakfast, and went to work. Every day. Even when her eyes were tired, even when the water heater broke down, even when her daughter slammed doors and cried about being the only kid without a father at school. "I'm not perfect," she had once told Camille in the middle of folding laundry, "but I am consistent. That counts for something." And it did. Camille grew up under a roof of quiet resilience. There were no dramatic speeches, no sweeping declarations of love, but there was soup on the stove every night. There were notes in her lunchbox during exam season. There was warmth, though it often came wrapped in silence. Their apartment was modest. 2 bedrooms, 1 small balcony, and a living room filled with books. Poetry lined the shelves. Prévert, Éluard, Rilke. Chantal believed in reading aloud. Even when Camille rolled her eyes, her mother would sit at the table and recite stanzas by heart, letting the words fill the room like light. "You don't have to understand a poem," she'd say. "You just have to feel it, like music." That was how Chantal lived. More like music than math, but she had rules. She believed in order, routine, consequence. Her classroom was never chaotic. Her students respected her, even if they feared her a little. Not because she yelled. She didn't have to. She just had that look, a pause, a tilt of the head, and suddenly everyone was back in their seats. Camille didn't understand how rare that was until she left for university. She remembered sitting in a packed lecture hall in Lyon, watching professors fumble with microphones, their words echoing into the void. She missed the clarity of her mother's voice, the way she could make a poem feel like a secret passed between friends. When Camille moved back home years later, after a failed relationship and a half-finished master's degree, Chantal didn't ask questions. She just cleared out the guest room, put fresh sheets on the bed, and made tea. She never said, "I told you so." She never said, "I'm proud of you," either. But Camille understood. Her mother didn't need to say things for them to be true. That winter, Chantal was still teaching, though she had mentioned retirement once or twice. She was 51, sharp as ever, but more tired than before. Her eyes lingered longer on the horizon. Her walks were slower. Camille thought it was age, stress. She didn't push. Then came the first sign, barely noticeable. A persistent headache that settled behind her eyes and refused to leave. She chalked it up to sinus pressure, maybe a reaction to the chalk dust, maybe not sleeping well. She took over-the-counter painkillers and carried on. Weeks passed. The pain stayed. One morning, Camille found her mother standing in front of the bathroom mirror, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "It's just sinus pressure," Chantal said. "Nothing dramatic." But Camille noticed her appetite was shrinking. She was losing weight. Her voice sounded thinner. A month later, the headaches worsened. Chantal went to the clinic. The general practitioner was dismissive. "Allergies," he said. "It's the season." He prescribed nasal spray and antihistamines. Told her to rest. She did. Another month went by. Still no change. Then came the loss of smell. "Everything tastes like cardboard," Chantal muttered one evening, pushing her plate away. "Even your soup." Camille laughed nervously, but her stomach clenched. "Go back to the doctor," she said. "They're overworked," Chantal replied. "I don't want to be dramatic." "But what if it's not allergies?" Camille pressed. "What if it's something else?" Her mother gave her that look, the one that silenced classrooms. But this time, it held fatigue, not authority. "I'll go," she said. "Next week." She didn't, not then. Camille began researching symptoms online. That was a mistake. Google made everything worse. Tumors, neurological diseases, sinus cancers she couldn't even pronounce. She sat in bed with her laptop glowing in the dark, terrified, angry, unsure what to say. It wasn't until Chantal's right eye began to bulge, slightly, subtly, just enough to change the symmetry of her face, that she finally agreed to more tests. Camille accompanied her to the hospital in Dijon. MRIs, scans, blood work, days of waiting. When the results came, the doctor didn't need to speak. It was all over his face. Camille gripped her mother's hand. The words were long, clinical. Esthesia neuroblastoma, rare, aggressive, low incidence, no established protocol. In that moment, Chantal didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She just exhaled. "So," she said softly, "it wasn't just allergies." The weeks following the diagnosis blurred into one another. Appointments, referrals, paperwork, silence. Everything moved both too fast and too slow. Camille watched her mother shrink inside her own body, still upright, still walking, but already retreating from the world. The oncologist explained the options with practiced gentleness. Aggressive radiation, experimental therapies, maybe surgery, if the tumor didn't press too far into the brain cavity. He spoke in terms like quality of life and progression risk. Chantal nodded politely, jotting notes as if she were preparing for a lecture. She asked no questions. Camille asked too many. "I just want to understand what we're up against," she said. The doctor glanced at Chantal, then back at Camille. "It's a rare form of cancer. Esthesia neuroblastoma affects the nasal cavity and the olfactory nerves. Very few cases per year. There are no clear treatment guidelines. We can try to contain it, but we can't promise anything. At home, Chantal opened a new notebook and began documenting everything: symptoms, medications, reactions. Camille offered to help. Chantal refused. "This is my project," she said. "You have your life." But Camille stayed. She adjusted her freelance work schedule, turned down contracts, and quietly moved her things back into her old bedroom. Her mother didn't protest. The changes came gradually at first: more headaches, sharp electric bursts that made her wince mid-sentence. She stopped teaching. Then came the bleeding. Thin trails of blood from her nose that stained tissues pink, then red. Her right eye, already shifted from the tumor, began to water constantly. Sunglasses became a necessity, even indoors. Camille noticed how people reacted. In the pharmacy, the cashier avoided eye contact. At the market, an old colleague of Chantal's offered a polite nod, then quickly turned down another aisle. One afternoon, while Camille helped her mother apply a warm compress to her face, Chantal whispered, "I see myself in their eyes. I scare them." "You don't scare me," Camille replied. "You're my daughter. You're supposed to lie to me. I'm not lying. You're not telling the truth either." The truth was complicated. Camille didn't know how to say that seeing her mother suffer terrified her, that watching her face warp, watching pain turn her sharp, proud mother into someone quieter, smaller, was like losing her in pieces. She wanted to be strong. But some nights, Camille cried in the bathroom with the water running, so her mother wouldn't hear. One evening after a particularly long day at the hospital, Chantal sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from a bowl of soup. She didn't touch it. "I can't taste anything anymore," she said. "Even this, your grandmother's recipe, it's just hot water." Camille sat down across from her. "That's normal, right?" she asked. "Because of the olfactory nerves?" Chantal nodded. "It's like eating memory. I know what it used to taste like, but now it's gone." Later that night, Camille read through a medical article she found online. It listed the early signs of sinonasal cancers: persistent nasal congestion, frequent nosebleeds, facial pain, numbness, vision changes, loss of smell. She counted them on her fingers, one by one. Her mother had had them all, and yet the first doctor had said allergies. How many others had been told the same, Camille wondered. How many had waited too long? The article ended with a note. "If symptoms persist beyond 3 weeks, particularly in adults over 45, seek specialized ENT evaluation. Early detection significantly improves outcomes." 3 weeks, not 5 months. Camille printed the page and pinned it on the refrigerator. Her mother didn't say anything, but the next day she took it down. The tumor grew. Radiation began. It left Chantal exhausted, nauseated, disoriented. The treatments attacked the cancer, but they also stripped away her appetite, her energy, her will. Her face swelled from inflammation. Her eye turned glassy. Her balance faltered. Camille began walking beside her, steadying her when they went outside. She bought a cane. Chantal refused to use it. In the rare moments of quiet, Camille tried to inject hope. "There are new studies," she'd say. "Clinical trials, immunotherapy options. Maybe we can apply." Her mother would smile, tired. "Maybe," but Camille recognized that look. It wasn't hope. It was appeasement, a kindness for her daughter's sake. They stopped going out as often. Chantal became more reclusive. She pulled away from phone calls, ignored texts. The woman who once stood before rooms of teenagers reciting poetry now avoided mirrors. Camille found her once, in the dark, sitting alone in the living room. "I don't recognize myself anymore," Chantal said. "When did I become a monster in my own home?" "You're not a monster." "But I am not me either." Camille sat beside her, held her hand, but no words came. Because what do you say to someone who has become a ghost of herself, while still breathing? One morning after Chantal had collapsed briefly from low blood pressure, Camille insisted on hiring a home nurse. Her mother resisted. "I don't want strangers in my house. You need help. I need my dignity. That's what I'm trying to preserve." The argument ended in silence, not resolved, just paused. Later, Chantal left a note on the fridge. "Thank you for staying." Camille didn't reply. She just started learning how to make her mother's tea exactly the way she liked it. Strong, with a touch of honey, and never too hot. The changes were no longer subtle. What had once been a shift in posture, a wince in the corner of the mouth, became something impossible to ignore. Chantal's face had begun to betray her. The tumor, now more aggressive, pushed outward. The right side of her face bulged slightly above the cheekbone, just beneath the eye socket. Her once symmetrical features now seemed uneven, distorted. Her right eye, already inflamed, began to drift outward, the white showing too much. She wore sunglasses most of the time, even indoors. But even behind the tinted lenses, Camille could see the swelling, the unnatural tension in her skin. Chantal no longer ate in public. She no longer walked through town. Her body was still mobile, but her world had shrunk to the size of their apartment. "I can't even smile," she said one morning, trying to adjust her mouth to pronounce the word properly. "It pulls strangely on the right side." Camille offered a weak laugh, trying to make light. "Well, at least you've always had a sarcastic smile. Now it just looks permanent." But Chantal didn't laugh. Her lips didn't move. There were practical problems too. Her sinuses were blocked almost completely. She couldn't breathe properly through her nose. Her mouth stayed open when she slept, her breathing ragged. She choked on liquids. She stopped eating anything that required effort to chew. Camille pureed meals. She fed her small spoonfuls. She helped her brush her hair, then stopped when Chantal began avoiding mirrors altogether. "You don't need to see me," her mother whispered once. "No one should." Camille tried to argue, but her voice always cracked when she lied. It wasn't that her mother was unrecognizable. It was that she had become a stranger to herself. The person who had once moved with such precision, such pride, now shuffled slowly across the living room, pausing every few steps as if the air itself had turned against her. They stopped answering the door unless it was for medical appointments. Friends stopped calling. Former students who had once sent letters or emails faded into silence. The last card Chantal received was from a colleague in Dijon, a generic message, wishing you peace during this difficult time. No return address. One afternoon, Camille offered to take her mother out for a short walk, just around the block, fresh air, sun on the face. Chantal agreed reluctantly. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and a large scarf wrapped carefully around her lower face. They didn't make it halfway before a child on a bicycle rode past and stared. He didn't say anything, just turned his head, eyes wide, unblinking. His mother caught up, took one look at Chantal, and quickly ushered the boy forward. Chantal said nothing. She didn't need to. That night, she wrote a single sentence in her notebook. Camille saw it the next morning when she went to refill her mother's tea. "They look at me like I've already died." Camille didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. She just kept showing up. Tea in the morning, soup at noon, a warm cloth in the evening. Small acts, like ritual, like resistance. But there were moments, between tasks, between silences, when she felt herself unraveling. She missed her mother. Not the body in the apartment, not the weakened voice or the fragile limbs. She missed the woman who quoted poetry at dinner, the woman who corrected her grammar mid-argument, the woman who laughed, truly laughed, when she saw something absurd in the world. And now that woman was fading, not just behind the illness, but behind the fear, the shame, the walls she had built to keep others from witnessing her decline. One evening, Camille sat alone in the kitchen. She opened a bottle of wine, poured a glass. She wasn't much of a drinker, but tonight felt like a night that required soft edges. She scrolled through her phone, photos, videos. One clip from 2 years ago showed Chantal in the garden, pointing out lavender stalks, humming an Edith Piaf tune. Her face was whole. Her smile was crooked, sarcastic as always. Camille watched it twice, then 3 times. And then she cried. She hadn't cried like this since the diagnosis, not when they got the scans, not when her mother lost her sense of smell, not even when she first noticed the deformity. But now, with the music playing softly through the phone speaker, with her mother asleep just one room away, she let herself fall apart. Because there was no room for grief in front of her mother, only duty. She cried for the woman she had lost and the stranger she was still trying to care for. She cried for all the words they never said, for the future that was slowly dissolving, unspoken. The next morning, Chantal noticed Camille's swollen eyes. "You were crying," Camille nodded. "A little." Chantal didn't ask why. She just reached out slowly and placed a thin hand on her daughter's cheek. "I'm sorry," she said. "For what?" "For becoming this." Camille held the hand against her face for a long time. "You're still you," she whispered. "You're still my mother." But even as she said it, she wondered, was that true? Or was she just clinging to the idea of someone who no longer existed? Chantal had started sleeping more. Sometimes entire afternoons would pass in silence. The only sound, the soft ticking of the clock above the kitchen stove. Camille tiptoed through the apartment, learning to measure time not in hours but in medications, in sips of water, in how many spoons of soup her mother managed to eat. One afternoon, Camille found her mother awake but still lying in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling. "You're up early," Camille said gently. "Am I?" Chantal replied. "It's hard to tell these days." Camille sat on the edge of the bed. "Want to read a bit? I can bring your book." Chantal shook her head slowly. "I can't concentrate. The words don't stay still anymore. They shift before I finish the sentence." Camille hesitated. "Would you like me to read to you?" Chantal's lips lifted in a near smile. "That would be nice." Camille read softly from a volume of Rilke. The words were slow, deliberate, like drops falling into water. Her mother listened with her eyes closed, her breath shallow but steady. After a few pages, Chantal spoke again, almost to herself. "Do you think people will remember me as I was? Or just as I look now?" Camille stopped reading. "They'll remember you as my mother," she said carefully. "As their teacher, as the woman who always smelled like lavender." "But they haven't seen that woman in months," Chantal whispered. "They've seen this, the face that makes children look away, the voice that can't finish a sentence. That's what sticks in people's minds. Not the years I taught them poetry, not the exams I stayed up all night to grade, just this body, this shell." Camille didn't know how to respond, because some part of her feared her mother was right. Chantal continued. "You know what frightens me more than dying?" Camille shook her head. "Disappearing," Chantal said. "Not from the earth, from memory, from meaning, from who I was." Camille leaned in. "I won't forget you." "You might," Chantal said gently. "People forget, even the ones they love." "I won't." Her mother didn't argue. She just looked away. Later that night, Camille sat alone in the kitchen, staring at her laptop. She thought about legacy, about the strange weight of memory, how people vanished not with death but with time, how voices faded and faces blurred, and what remained were fragments, scents, phrases, a photograph left in a drawer. She thought about how little of her mother's life had been recorded. No memoirs, no videos, just bits of writing in notebooks and test papers graded in red ink. A life of giving, mostly undocumented. She opened a new document and typed, "She used to read to me when I couldn't sleep. Not fairy tales, but poetry. Neruda, Prévert, Rilke. She said poetry was the soul's language, that we didn't have to understand it, just feel it. I didn't understand her back then. I do now." Camille saved the file. It felt small, inadequate, but it was something. The next morning, she mentioned the idea. "What if we wrote something together?" she asked. "Your story, in your words." Chantal was sitting by the window, wrapped in her favorite gray shawl. "My story?" she repeated. "Yes, for others, or for me, or for you, just so it doesn't disappear." Her mother looked out the window. It was early spring, and the lavender plants on the balcony were just beginning to green again. "I don't know if I have anything left to say," she murmured. "You do," Camille insisted, "even if it's just how you feel, or what you wish people knew." Chantal didn't answer right away, but later that day, Camille found her with a pen in hand and her old notebook open. She didn't ask what her mother was writing. She just smiled quietly and left her to it. The next few days passed in fragile calm. Chantal wrote in short bursts, sometimes half a page, sometimes just a few lines. She rested in between. Camille kept reading to her, making tea, brushing her hair. One evening, as Camille was folding laundry, her mother called out from the bedroom. "Camille? Yes? Do you remember when you were 8 and you broke the neighbor's window?" Camille blinked. "You told me to say it was the wind." Chantal chuckled softly. "I never believed you'd actually do it. You told me it was poetic." "It was poetic," her mother said. "Even in chaos, there's something beautiful." Camille sat down on the bed beside her mother. "Why bring that up now?" Chantal reached for her hand. "Because I want you to remember those things. Not just this, not just now." "I remember everything," Camille whispered. "No, you remember enough, but I want you to have more." They sat in silence, fingers entwined. Outside, the sky began to darken, and the wind carried the faint scent of lavender from the balcony. That night, Chantal stayed up late, writing longer than usual. Her pen scratched slowly but deliberately across the page. Camille didn't ask what it was. Not yet. But something in her knew. Her mother wasn't just writing for herself anymore. She was writing for someone else. For those who had turned away. For those who had forgotten. For someone who might, someday, need to understand what it meant to live inside a dying body and still long for dignity. The idea came late one night. Chantal had been quiet for hours, more so than usual. She hadn't written that day. She hadn't even opened her notebook. Camille had begun to wonder if the spark was fading again, if the will to speak had retreated back into the shadows of pain. But then, just before midnight, Camille passed her mother's room and saw a faint light under the door. She peeked in. Chantal was sitting upright, her back stiff with determination, a pen in hand. Several crumpled pages lay on the floor. Camille didn't enter. She only said softly, "Do you need anything?" Chantal shook her head without looking up. "No, just time." By morning, the letter was done. Camille found it folded neatly on the kitchen table, beside an envelope and a list of addresses Chantal had printed the week before. It was addressed to the French Minister of Health. Not a cry for help, not a complaint, a plea. Camille picked it up and began to read. To the Minister of Health, I do not write to you as a protester or a patient or a victim. I write to you as a woman who has spent her life serving others, teaching, raising a child, contributing quietly and without fuss to the country we both call home. I am 52 years old. I have esthesia neuroblastoma, a rare and aggressive form of cancer that has disfigured my face, robbed me of my senses, and made my daily existence a cage of pain. There are days when blinking hurts. There are days when I forget the taste of food, the sound of my own laughter. I do not fear dying. I fear living like this indefinitely. I understand that the law, as it stands, does not permit assisted dying. I understand the weight of such a law, the fear that it might be misused. I do not ask for blanket permissions or reckless freedoms. I ask for one thing, that someone in your position sees me, not just my illness, me. I was once a teacher. I taught literature. I taught children to think critically, to ask questions. Today I ask you, what is the moral value of prolonging suffering when there is no hope of recovery? What good does it serve to keep a person alive in agony, stripped of identity, locked in a body that no longer reflects their soul? I am not requesting death. I am requesting dignity. I am requesting the right to decide when enough is enough. And I am requesting that the law trust the humanity of doctors, rather than binding their hands with fear. If nothing changes, I will not rage. I have already made my peace. But if this letter sits unread in a pile of administrative paperwork, if it vanishes without a whisper, then I will have died twice, once in body and once in voice. Please do not let that happen. Sincerely, Chantal Sibir. Camille folded the letter back with trembling hands. It was not dramatic, it was not angry, but it was devastating. She looked across the room. Her mother sat in her usual chair by the window, her face turned slightly toward the weak spring sun. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Camille sat down at the kitchen table and addressed the envelope. She added postage, made sure the address was correct. The next morning, she mailed it. They didn't talk about the letter, not directly, but something shifted between them. Camille sensed that her mother had, in her own quiet way, taken control of her narrative. That even if nothing came of it, she had reclaimed a part of herself. Days passed, then a week, no reply. No call, no letter, no acknowledgement from the ministry. Camille checked the mailbox twice a day. Chantal never asked. She never looked expectant. Only once did she mention it, over tea. "Do you think it got there?" Camille nodded. "Yes." "Do you think anyone read it?" Camille hesitated. "I hope so." Her mother nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. A few days later, Camille found her mother reading the letter again. Not the sent copy, but a draft she had kept in her notebook. Her finger traced the lines slowly, as if reaffirming her own words. "It's strange," she said. "I wrote to someone I'll never meet, about a life they'll never live. But they might understand," Camille offered. "Or they might forget," Chantal said, "like most people do." That evening, Camille printed the letter again and translated it into English. She didn't know why, perhaps out of impulse, perhaps out of fear that the original would vanish. She saved it on her computer under a folder labeled Maman. Not letters or final words, just Maman. No one from the ministry ever responded, but the silence said enough. Chantal filed the request with the local court in Dijon 2 weeks after sending the letter. She didn't announce it, didn't make a scene. She simply asked Camille to print a set of documents and help her fill out a few lines she was too weak to write herself. Camille didn't question it. She wanted to. But something about her mother's calm, measured, composed, made it clear that this wasn't an act of desperation. It was an act of clarity. "I'm not asking to die," Chantal said. "I'm asking not to be forced to remain." The court accepted the paperwork with the bureaucratic neutrality of any other request. No raised eyebrows, no protest. Just stamps, copies, a waiting period. Camille held onto a flicker of hope. Perhaps someone, somewhere in the system would understand, would make an exception, would choose mercy over protocol. But 3 weeks later, the official response arrived by mail. A thin envelope, folded precisely, the language cold and clinical. Request denied. Grounds: incompatibility with existing criminal law and medical ethics. No physician may legally assist in the termination of life, regardless of patient consent. Camille read the letter twice, then a third time. She brought it to her mother without a word. Chantal read it slowly, her hands steady. When she finished, she folded it carefully and placed it beside her teacup. "That was expected," she said simply. "But it's not right," Camille replied, her voice low and shaking. "It's not right, Maman." "It's legal," Chantal said. "And the law doesn't have to be right, only consistent." "But they know you're suffering." "They know," Chantal agreed. "They also know they're not allowed to stop it." A few days later, Camille arranged a meeting with Dr. Moreau, the physician who had overseen much of Chantal's treatment. He had kind eyes and a tired posture, the kind that spoke of years spent delivering impossible news. He met them at the hospital in a small consultation room, neutral walls and soft lighting, meant to comfort. Camille sat beside her mother, holding her hand. Dr. Moreau glanced at the court letter, then at Chantal. "I'm sorry," he said, voice low. "Truly." "You don't have to apologize," Chantal said. "I know your hands are tied." He nodded. "I wish they weren't." Camille leaned forward. "But can't something be done? Privately? Quietly?" The doctor looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said gently. "Even if I agreed, even if I believed it was the right thing to do, the law is explicit. If I helped your mother end her life, I could lose my license, face criminal charges." "But she's asking for help," Camille whispered. "She's not being forced. She's not suicidal. She's asking for peace." "I know, doctor, I know," Moreau said. "But I have a family, a mortgage, other patients. I've seen this before, Camille. Good people in impossible pain. But I am not the law. I am only a man with a stethoscope and a limited number of choices." Chantal placed her hand on Camille's arm. "He's not the enemy." "I didn't say he was." "I know, but you want someone to blame." Camille turned away, blinking hard. Chantal looked back at the doctor. "Thank you for your honesty." He nodded. "If I could prescribe you dignity, Madame Sibir, I would." Back home, Camille paced the living room while Chantal rested. "I hate this," she muttered to herself. "I hate that we've done everything right, followed every rule, and still, there's no mercy." She found herself pulling up articles, reading about countries where euthanasia was legal. Switzerland, the Netherlands, Belgium. She calculated travel costs, legal requirements, waiting periods. All of it was too expensive, too complex, too late. At one point, she whispered out loud, "If we had been born in the wrong country, maybe we'd at least have the right to end it." Then she realized they had been. Later that evening, she sat at the edge of her mother's bed. "They said no," she repeated, as if hoping the words would land differently this time. Chantal opened her eyes. "They did. What now?" Her mother took a long breath. "Now, we decide how to keep going, or how not to." "You're not thinking of—" "I'm thinking of nothing tonight," Chantal said gently. "Just rest. Tomorrow can be for thinking." Camille curled up beside her on top of the covers like she had when she was small. Her mother's breathing was uneven but steady, and for a moment it almost felt like peace. But under the surface, Camille felt something stir. Not rage, not grief, helplessness. A vast, quiet helplessness that wrapped around her like fog. Not because her mother was dying, but because no one, no institution, no court, no doctor, was allowed to help her die well. It was Camille who first suggested they go public. Not because she wanted attention, not because she thought it would change the law, but because something about the silence, the polite refusals, the legal dead ends, the unread letters, felt like a second death, a quieter one, a disappearance. "I'm not ashamed of you," Camille said one afternoon, "but I feel like the world is pretending you don't exist." Chantal raised an eyebrow. "You want to put me on television?" "I want people to see you, to know this is real, that you're not a headline, you're a person." Chantal didn't respond right away. She sipped her tea, as much as she could manage, then placed the cup down with trembling hands. "Fine," she said, "but no soft filters." A local journalist, Mathieu Bernard, was the first to respond. He had covered medical ethics stories in the past and promised a respectful segment, no sensationalism, no dramatic editing, just honesty. The interview took place in their living room. Camille moved the books and photographs off the shelves behind the couch. The camera was discreet, the lighting natural. Chantal sat upright, dressed in a loose blouse and a scarf that she deliberately did not use to cover her face. Mathieu asked gentle questions. "What do you want people to understand about your situation?" "That it's not about death," Chantal said. "It's about choice, about the ability to end a life with the same dignity with which we try to live it." "You've been denied legal support to end your life. How does that make you feel?" She paused. "Like a child who's been told no without explanation. Like I'm being punished for asking to leave the table." Camille sat just off camera watching. She wasn't sure what she expected, but she wasn't prepared for how calm her mother sounded. Not angry, not pleading, just resolute. After the interview aired, the response was immediate. Letters, emails, phone calls, some full of empathy, some full of fury. Some praised her courage. Others accused her of being selfish, of devaluing life, of setting a dangerous precedent. One particularly cruel email read, "My father died of cancer and he never once asked to die. You're a coward." Chantal read it without flinching. "He must have loved his father very much," she said. Another letter, handwritten, came from a retired nurse in Lyon. "You are saying what so many of us are afraid to say out loud. I cared for patients like you. I saw what you're describing. Thank you for speaking." A few days later, Camille answered a call from a Paris-based TV station. They were doing a panel discussion on end-of-life rights. They wanted Chantal to appear, virtually, if she was able. Camille looked at her mother, who was resting on the couch. "They want you on a panel," she said, "with a few doctors and a priest." Chantal smirked. "Of course. You don't have to do it. You don't have to. I want to." The panel aired live on a Friday evening. Chantal's video feed came from their apartment. She wore a navy cardigan, her hair combed back, her face visible in full. The priest, a silver-haired man named Father Lucien, sat stiffly in the studio, his collar crisp, his eyes already wary. The host opened with introductions, then dove into the topic. "Madame Sebir, some say your request undermines the sanctity of life. How do you respond?" Chantal didn't blink. "I believe life is sacred, which is why I don't want mine reduced to a slow, unnecessary suffering. Sanctity does not mean prolonging agony. It means honoring the person living it," Father Lucien responded. "With all due respect, suffering has meaning. In our faith, it is not something to escape. It is something to endure with grace." Chantal's face remained steady. "Enduring pain does not make one more holy. It only makes one hurt." The host turned to Camille. "You've cared for your mother throughout this. What's your perspective?" Camille hesitated. The screen showed her mother in the corner, pale, tired, but composed. "I think," Camille said carefully, "that no one who hasn't lived this should decide what's dignified for someone else." The debate continued, measured, intense. But what stayed with viewers was one exchange. Father Lucien, his voice low, said, "Life is a gift. We don't get to return it." Chantal replied, "But we do get to know when it's no longer ours to hold." That line was quoted online for days. Some called it powerful, others called it dangerous. In the days that followed, more journalists reached out. A petition circulated. Law students wrote essays. Religious groups protested outside government buildings. Chantal watched it unfold from her window, a blanket around her shoulders. "I didn't mean to start a movement," she said. "But you did," Camille replied. Chantal smiled faintly. "Let's hope it goes somewhere." But even as her name spread, Chantal grew weaker. And Camille, watching it all unfold, realized something. Her mother was no longer asking for permission. She was preparing to act, permission or not. Camille sensed it before anything was said, not from a dramatic announcement or a lingering look, but from the way her mother moved that day, more carefully than usual, but with a strange calm, a kind of quiet resolve. She made her tea without help, folded her shawl with precision, even combed her hair back and asked for the lavender oil they hadn't used in weeks. Camille helped her dab a little behind her ears. "Special occasion?" she asked lightly, trying to smile. Chantal met her gaze in the mirror. "I'd like to feel like myself, just for tonight." Camille nodded. She didn't ask more. They spent the afternoon sitting by the window, watching the sky shift through pale blues and soft oranges. The lavender on the balcony had started to bloom again, fragile purple against the still, cool spring air. As the sun dipped lower, Chantal asked for her old photo albums. Camille brought them one by one. They looked through pages of black and white memories. A young Chantal on a school trip, her wedding day in a modest dress, Camille as a baby with wild curls and a toothless grin. "God, I was tired back then," Chantal murmured, pointing to one photo of Camille in a high chair. "You never slept." "You used to sing to me," Camille recalled, "when nothing else worked." Chantal chuckled. Mostly to stay sane. They laughed. A small sound, but real. Dinner was simple, just soup and a soft roll. Chantal ate slowly, savoring what little she could still taste. Camille didn't rush her. Every gesture felt sacred, like a ritual neither of them had practiced but somehow knew by heart. Afterward, Camille helped her into bed, but instead of pulling away, she lingered, perching on the edge of the mattress like she had so many times before. Chantal looked up. "Stay?" she asked. Camille nodded. She didn't even answer. She just crawled in beside her mother, on top of the blanket, careful not to disturb the fragile outline beneath. The lights were dim. The room smelled faintly of lavender and tea. Outside, the wind moved gently through the balcony plants. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Chantal whispered, "Are you scared?" Camille turned her head. "Of what?" "Of me. Leaving." Camille exhaled slowly. "I used to be. And now? Now, I'm scared for you to stay. Like this." Chantal didn't reply immediately. Her fingers reached for Camille's and they laced them together. "I'm not afraid," she said, "not anymore." Camille blinked hard. "Did you make a plan?" A pause, then, "Yes." Camille nodded. Her throat tightened. "Will it hurt?" "No." Another silence. "I won't ask how," Camille said. "But I want you to know, I forgive you. Not that you need it, but I do." Chantal squeezed her hand. "Thank you." They lay there for what felt like hours. At some point, Camille closed her eyes. She thought of all the nights her mother had stayed up with her, during fevers, after nightmares, on exam nights when sleep wouldn't come. Now it was her turn to stay awake, but exhaustion caught up, slowly, gently. When Camille awoke, it was still dark. Chantal was asleep. Her breath was slow, steady. Camille didn't move. She lay beside her, eyes open, listening. A part of her wanted to ask, "Is this the last night?" But she already knew. In the quiet, Camille whispered, "I love you." She didn't know if her mother heard, but she hoped so. Morning arrived quietly, the kind of dawn that doesn't announce itself, but slips into a room like a gentle visitor. Pale light crept across the curtains, tracing soft shapes on the wall. The air was still, heavy with the faint scent of lavender. Camille stirred. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. The room felt suspended between night and day, as if time itself had stopped to listen. Then it came to her, her mother's breathing, the rhythm she had learned to measure her world by. Except now, it wasn't there. Not gone, just still. Camille didn't move. She stayed lying there, eyes open, letting the silence expand until it filled the room. A strange peace settled over her, not shock, not even grief. Just an awareness, like realizing that something infinite had finally finished its sentence. The air felt lighter somehow, the shadows softer. She turned her head slowly toward her mother's side of the bed. The blanket was smooth, perfectly arranged. A teacup rested on the nightstand, empty. Next to it, a single dried lavender stem. Camille reached out and touched it. The petals were brittle, yet they still carried that unmistakable fragrance, the same scent that had followed her mother all her life. She lifted it to her nose and breathed in deeply. It didn't smell like loss. It smelled like home. She whispered, "Good morning," though the words broke halfway through. There were no notes, no letters, no instructions. Just the room as it always was, neat, quiet, full of small details that had become their world. The shawl folded on the chair, the notebook on the desk closed, the cup of pencils sharpened to identical lengths. Camille stood slowly, her feet finding the cold tiles. She opened the window a little. Morning air swept in, cool and clean, brushing against her face. The lavender plants outside swayed gently in the breeze. From the street below, the sound of distant footsteps, a bicycle bell, the faint murmur of a bakery opening. Life going on, ordinary and unstoppable. Camille rested her hands on the windowsill. Her heart felt strangely steady, heavy but steady. She looked out at the sky, at the light stretching across the roofs of Plombières-les-Dijon. For the first time in months, she didn't feel trapped. There was no waiting, no dread of what might come next. There was only what was, and the quiet knowledge that her mother's pain had ended, and that somehow that was enough. The world outside glowed in soft gold. In the distance, the church bells began to ring. Camille had never noticed how gentle they sounded at this hour, how they seemed less like a summons and more like a farewell. She let them play out. When the final chime faded, she turned back into the room. Her eyes fell on the notebook on the desk. She hesitated, then walked over and opened it. The last page was almost blank. Almost. In the center, in her mother's small, precise handwriting, were 6 words. "Don't cry. Live while you can." Camille stared at them for a long time. Her throat tightened, but she didn't cry. Not yet. The words didn't invite tears. They gave permission. Permission to keep breathing, to keep moving, to keep becoming. She closed the notebook carefully and placed it back where she found it. Then she sat by the window again, wrapped in her mother's shawl, letting the morning light touch her face. She thought about everything they had shared in those last months. The laughter that still managed to break through, the small arguments that didn't matter, the simple rituals that had somehow become sacred. She thought about how much strength it took to face pain with grace, and how much love it took to let someone go with peace. The apartment was silent, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full, invisible, but full. Camille whispered into the quiet, "You're free now, Maman." Outside, a bird landed on the balcony rail, pecking lightly at the lavender leaves. The movement was small, almost invisible, but in that moment, it felt like the world's softest answer. Camille smiled, a fragile curve of her lips, and let her hand rest on the lavender stem beside her. The petals brushed her skin, and for the first time she didn't flinch at the touch of memory. The sun climbed higher, flooding the room with light. It wasn't an ending, not really, just a change of form. Somewhere in the stillness she could almost hear her mother's voice again. Not words, not language, just presence. A kind of echo that said, "I'm here. I always will be." Camille closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and sat there until the warmth of morning became day. And when she finally stood up, it was with a steadiness that surprised her. The day waited quietly beyond the window. Life waited, and this time she didn't hesitate to step toward it. Weeks passed before Camille could walk through the apartment without expecting to hear her mother's voice. The silence was no longer unbearable, but it was different, dense, like a presence that refused to fade. Every corner of the home still carried her trace, the faint scent of lavender on the curtains, the books marked with her handwriting, the folded shawl resting on the chair. Camille found herself moving carefully around these things, as if afraid to disturb their quiet equilibrium. But grief, she learned, is not a straight line. It's a tide, sometimes soft, sometimes violent, but always returning. She spent days sorting papers, reading through old notebooks. Most were filled with lesson plans, fragments of poems, half-finished letters. Then she found it, the draft of the letter her mother had written to the Minister of Health, the same letter Camille had helped mail months before. She read it again, this time aloud. The words no longer sounded like a plea. They sounded like a manifesto, gentle but resolute. When she finished, she whispered, "People should hear this." And so she decided they would. Tang. A few weeks later, Camille reached out to Mathieu Bernard, the journalist who had first interviewed her mother. He still remembered. "I want to share her letter publicly," Camille said over the phone. "Not to argue, to remind people that she existed." Mathieu paused. "Would you be willing to read it yourself?" Camille hesitated. "Yes, she said finally. But not in a studio, in her garden. The garden wasn't large, just a patch of soil behind the apartment, a few meters of lavender and rosemary framed by stone walls. Her mother had planted it years ago, tending it every spring, pruning carefully until it became a living mirror of her patience. Camille cleaned it up, trimming the dry stems, replanting new ones. She placed a small wooden sign near the entrance. Le Jardin de Chantal, a place for peace, a place to breathe. When the news segment aired, Camille's voice was calm but strong. She stood among the lavender, holding the letter in her hands. Her tone was not mournful, but steady, like someone reading a truth long overdue. Afterward, messages poured in, from doctors, from caregivers, from families who had watched loved ones suffer through terminal illness without support. One email came from a nurse in Chicago. "We don't have laws like this here either, but we talk about dignity all the time. Your mother's words made me remember why I became a nurse." Another came from a woman in Belgium. "We changed our laws 10 years ago. It wasn't easy, but we started by listening to people like your mother." Camille read every letter. Some brought tears, others brought comfort, but all of them reminded her that her mother's voice hadn't disappeared. It had multiplied. The months passed. Spring turned to summer. Camille found herself speaking at small gatherings, church halls, community centers, medical schools. She didn't talk about death. She talked about care, about listening, about how a system could preserve life without stripping away its meaning. At one of these events, a young medical student asked, "If you could change one thing about how we treat terminal patients, what would it be?" Camille thought for a moment. "I would teach compassion as a skill, not an instinct," she said. "Because instincts fade under pressure, but skills stay." Her words were quoted in an article later titled, "The Daughter Who Stayed." She smiled at the irony. She hadn't stayed by choice, not at first, but now she stayed by purpose. That autumn, Camille organized the first community event in her mother's garden. A small group gathered, neighbors, doctors, caregivers, even a few students from the school where Chantal once taught. They read poetry, shared tea, and spoke softly about the people they had lost. There were no speeches, no politics, just presence. At sunset, Camille stood by the lavender beds, holding a small notebook. "This garden isn't about endings," she said quietly. "It's about what comes after. My mother used to say that pain teaches us to see. Maybe that's true, but love teaches us to stay." The wind rustled through the lavender, carrying the scent across the small crowd. No one applauded. They just listened. Later that evening, Camille sat alone on the same bench where her mother once wrote. The air was cool, the stars faint but visible. She opened her own notebook, the one she'd started months ago, and began to write. "When she was alive, my mother taught me that courage doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like gentleness, like choosing not to hide, like smiling even when your reflection doesn't smile back." She paused, then continued. "I don't believe my mother wanted to die. I think she wanted to stop being invisible. And maybe, in telling her story, I can help others be seen before it's too late." She closed the notebook and looked up at the stars. Somewhere she imagined her mother was still teaching, still urging someone, somewhere, to think, to feel, to question. And Camille, in her own quiet way, kept answering. A year later, France introduced a new initiative in medical ethics training, end-of-life human dignity sessions. The pilot program included Chantal's letter as a reading assignment. Mathieu sent Camille the news article. She smiled as she read the headline. "From silence to change, one woman's words inspire a movement." She printed it out and placed it inside her mother's old notebook, right after the page that said, "Don't cry, live while you can." Then she walked out to the garden. The lavender was in full bloom again. The air hummed with bees. Camille knelt, touching the soil gently. "Maman," she whispered, "you're still teaching." And for the first time in a long while, she felt not sorrow, but gratitude. The microphone blinked red. Camille leaned forward, adjusted her headphones, and took a deep breath. She had rehearsed the opening line 3 times already, deleted it twice. Still, her hands were trembling. This wasn't a podcast about grief. or medicine, or law. It was about a voice, one that had nearly gone unheard. She clicked record. "Hello," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "My name is Camille, and this is the first episode of Letters for the Living." She paused. Just a moment. "This podcast isn't about death. It's about what we do with the time we're given, and what we owe to those who had less time than they deserved." She reached for a folded piece of paper beside her. "You've never met my mother, Chantal Sabir, but today I want you to hear her words, not mine." She began to read slowly. "I do not write to you as a protester or a patient or a victim. I write to you as a woman who has spent her life serving others, teaching, raising a child, contributing quietly and without fuss to the country we both call home." Camille's voice wavered slightly, but she didn't stop. As she read, she could feel the weight of the words settle around her, not heavy, but solid. True. She finished the letter. Silence followed. Then softly, "She didn't live to hear a reply, but you just did." Another pause. "And if these words stirred something in you, even discomfort, even doubt, then maybe that's where change begins." She closed the session. The audio would be edited later, music added. But for now, it was done. She stepped outside, headphones still around her neck, into the cool evening air. The lavender garden glowed in twilight. A child's laughter echoed from a nearby window. Somewhere, someone was playing piano, soft, halting notes that faded before they resolved. Camille sat on the bench, eyes closed. Her grief had changed. It was no longer a wound. It was a weight she carried with choice. She remembered something her mother had once said: "What matters most is not whether we are seen, but whether we refuse to disappear." And Chantal had refused, not through anger, not through rebellion, but through honesty, through one letter, one voice. Weeks later, the podcast went live. Listeners responded quietly at first. A few comments, some emails, then more. One message came from a woman in California. "I'm caring for my father, stage 4. He can't speak anymore, but I feel like your mother gave him a voice." Another from a doctor in Quebec. "I played your podcast for my palliative care team. We cried, and then we talked, for hours." Camille replied to every message, not because she had answers, but because she had once needed someone to answer her, and no one had. Months passed, the garden grew fuller, brighter. People visited. Some left flowers. Others just sat in silence. A small plaque was added near the gate. "In memory of Chantal Sabir, who taught us not how to die, but how to be heard." Camille continued recording episodes, stories of caregivers, of patients, of quiet heroes no one had thought to thank. Each voice added another petal to a garden that kept blooming long after the gardener was gone. One afternoon, as autumn colored the trees in soft gold, Camille returned to the bench. She had brought nothing with her, no microphone, no paper, just herself. She sat for a long while, letting the sun warm her face. Then, to no one in particular, she whispered, "If you were still here, Maman, I'd tell you I'm okay, that I found something to hold on to, that I learned how to keep listening." She smiled softly, and then quietly, almost without meaning to, she added, "Merci." Oh. Somewhere far beyond the edge of the garden, a breeze stirred the lavender, soft but unmistakable. And in that moment, Camille didn't feel like she was ending something. She felt like she was beginning. Sometimes dignity isn't about how we die. It's about how we are allowed to live, even in our final days. Picture this, a small lavender garden quietly blooming behind an old apartment in Dijon. No monument, no statue, just peace. And a name carved in wood, Chantal. She never asked to be remembered as a fighter. She just asked to be heard. If you were in her place, or if it were someone you loved, what choice would you have made? We want to know. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story could help someone else feel a little less alone. And if this story moved you, even just for a moment, subscribe for more true stories that don't just inform, they stay with you. Because some voices once heard can never be forgotten.